Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Mark said that he won't wake up at 7 a.m. for just anybody. So I'm really grateful to Mark and everybody else, Bob, David, who woke up really, really early for this webinar. Really happy for you to be here. Thanks for those who stayed up a little bit later in the far east to join us. We're really grateful. This is the best time for us to have these webinars to cross all the time zones. And I appreciate for some of that, it's in the middle of, dinner or breakfast. So appreciate that very, very much. Mark Dombrov, thanks for joining us. David Rimmer, it's always so good to see you. I'm going to hand you guys over now to Barb, as she'll be facilitating this today, while I keep a close eye on the Q&A today. Thanks, Barb.
Thank you. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Barbara Webster. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Americas for Go Crisis, and I have been working directly with Marie for about the last 5 years, and I've gotten to know many of you that are on this webinar today, so I'm thrilled to be here. I'm also thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce two individuals that I think are just incredible human beings. The first of which, David Rimmer, is one of our senior associates. So I'd like David to introduce himself, tell us a little about your background, and then we'll move to Mark. David?
Thanks, Barb, and thanks for inviting me to participate today. I'm a private aviation executive. I've been in the business for just over 20 or so years. It's a second career. I started in sales and marketing at a company called Excellair, and since that start, I've become president of 3 fairly decent-sized operators in the United States. Excellair, which is the subject of our conversation this morning, Alarion, and Talon-Air. And my trial by fire came, as we'll talk about, unexpectedly, but I think my combination of media experience and leadership experience prepared me for as much as you can be prepared for what I experienced. So I'm looking forward to talking about it today.
Thank you, David. We're very, very proud to have you as one of our senior associates at Go Crisis, so thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce all of you to Mr. Mark Dombrov. I had the pleasure of meeting Mark it's been about 13 years ago, I think. But Mark is on our advisory board, and he is also the general counsel for Go Crisis. Mark, could you please introduce yourself to those who have not had the pleasure of meeting you?
Sure. Thank you, Barb, and thank you, Marie and Henny, for making sure all the pieces here stick together. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody. As Barb indicated, I'm Mark Dombrov. I'm an attorney. I started my career with the Federal Aviation Administration as an attorney in their litigation division. I then moved to the U.S. Department of Justice, where I became the director of aviation. My client was the United States, or the client that we had, and we had about 100 lawyers representing the United States in all things aviation, whether it involved accidents or whatever, and involving the FAA, the military services, and so forth. I then went into private practice, and we have an aviation team of about 20 lawyers that represent airlines and other aviation industry members pretty much worldwide, whether it's in the context of emergency preparedness, emergency response, liability, insurance issues, regulatory issues, and on occasion, unfortunately, in the context of the criminalization of aviation accidents, which while it has been somewhat more the norm outside the United States, has started, as we'll talk about, to take some hold within the United States. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Barbara.
Thank you so much. David, I'm going to turn this over to you. Henny is going to bring up a presentation that you have. I think it's important that we set the stage, because when we're talking about criminalization of accidents, we want to come to you in terms of having been there and done that. And David certainly has been through this. And so I think it's important that that we set the stage with the experience that you had, David, and to enlighten everybody as to what you went through during those circumstances.
Sure. I'll refer to some of the pictures as they go by to explain their significance. But it was in 2006, I was an executive vice president at a company called Acceler, which is a Part 135 business jet operator in New York on Long Island. And we were tasked with taking delivery of a brand new Embraer Legacy 600 from the factory in Brazil. So a small team bus went down to Brazil, including two pilots, Jan Palladino and Joe Lepore, our sales executive from Embraer, Henry Yandel, and a reporter from the New York Times named Joe Sharkey, and Ralph Michelli, our director of maintenance. We all went down to Brazil to go through the delivery process. And deliveries are a process for anybody who's taken delivery of a new aircraft. It's an exhilarating process. It's usually a little bit of a bumpy road because you're still negotiating last minute details of the delivery, and it culminates in sort of a I won't say celebration, but it is a celebration of sorts when you go through buying a new airplane, outfitting it, and having it ready to finally take delivery. So we spent the week in Brazil preparing for this event, and it culminated with a pre-delivery ceremony. It's a celebration for the manufacturer because they finally get paid for all their efforts, and our pay is to be able to have this brand new airplane. And our day quickly turned from celebration to tragedy on the last day when we were flying the airplane, what was supposed to be a two-stop journey back to the United States. And I should explain the context of why Joe Sharkey from the New York Times was there. When we had this opportunity to pick up a brand new airplane, I thought it was a great opportunity to get some attention to our company. So I consulted with our PR representative, Lisa Hendrickson, and I said, you know, there's nothing I'd like to be written about more than in the New York Times and Business Jet Traveler magazine. Let's invite Joe Sharkey to this. And little did I know the crucial role that Joe would play in this event. So we finished with the formalities. We had the celebration. The pilots went off to plan for the trip home, which involved an overnight stop in Manaus before importing the airplane into the United States. And between San Jose, where the airplane was manufactured, and that's a picture of the airplane in the delivery hangar. Between San Jose and Manaus, we had an event that would certainly change my life and tragically changed the lives of 154 people and their loved ones and associates. We experienced a mid-air collision at 37,000 feet. It was just an earth-shattering event with two airplanes traveling at 500 or so miles an hour under positive air traffic control. And here we are in a collision. We didn't realize it was a collision at the time. What happened was that we were at cruise speed, cruise altitude. I was standing in the aisle, and all of a sudden we all felt this incredible jolt of the airplane, and we had no idea what it was. I went to go sit down just in case it was weather related, although it seemed to be a clear day, just in case there was going to be more of an in-flight upset. When Henry Yandel looked out the window and said, "Guys, we've been hit." And there are a few more chilling expressions you can hear in an airplane than for somebody to look out and see that there's damage to the airplane. So we all looked off to the left side of the airplane and saw that the winglet That's the actually right side winglet with Ralph Michelli, our director of maintenance, doing some inspection before we took delivery. Instead of this sleek winglet that you see in this picture with the Exceller sort of swoop logo, there was a jagged bit of metal and no other explanation. We didn't see anything. All we did was we felt the in-flight upset and we saw the result. These are our two pilots. On the left is Jan Palladino, on the right, Joe Lepore. That's the winglet. If we could go back just to that previous slide, that's the winglet that was hit. And it would be, it's a beautiful airplane. It's a beautiful piece of metal. So relaxed was our flight. Ralph was asleep. There was just nothing unusual about this delivery until that moment, when we were involved in a midair collision, which is probably for that's Daniel Bachman from Embraer and Henry Yandel, again, minutes before the accident. You know, a midair collision, we've been talking about it a lot since the accident over the Potomac in Washington. Two airplanes under air traffic control's oversight, midair collisions just shouldn't happen. That's why they're so rare. They've become increasingly rare as technology has improved, but somehow at that point, we had no reason to we had no understanding of why we were involved in this terribly deadly accident that resulted in the deaths of 154 people.
David, will you tell us when to click on for your presentation? We don't want to rush you through it. We're just not sure when to change. So will you give Henny the thumbs up when you want him to change it?
Sure, we can move through the rest of the pictures if you like, and I can give some commentary. That's from Flight International magazine, and it shows our expected flight path, and of course the point of collision just outside of Brasilia. You can go to the next slide. It's first view outside the window of the left side of the airplane. It's just a shocking thing to see what was a whole airplane seconds before with that kind of damage and not understanding the implications of it. You can see the next one. I think the next is a closer view. So you could see not only was the winglet sheared off, but on the leading, just above the leading edge of the wing, there are gaps that we were, in fact, more concerned about the gaps and any structural damage to the wing than just the shearing off of the winglet, because we really didn't know. We had no idea how deep the damage went and how it might affect our airworthiness or our ability to land safely. And we were airborne after the accident, after the collision, for 35 minutes, headed to a very remote military base in the Brazilian Amazon. It was it's chilling, and you know that you don't know anything. That's what you realize. You don't know anything. When the airplane gets slowed down, you don't know if it's going to upset the airworthiness. When the flaps are extended, when the landing gear comes down, we just had no idea if the next change would be our last.
Mm-hmm.
That's another view. It's hard to describe. You know, we all focus on this winglet, but as I said, the underlying structural risks that were going on were the unknowns. And what I did know is that the autopilot kicked off immediately upon the collision, and the pilots, I wouldn't say they struggled to retain control of the airplane, but there was pretty substantial deflection of the yoke to stay straight and level. And again, it was trial by error because nobody knew what the response might be and whether there was anything that was unrecoverable as we continued to fly and continued to search for a safe place to land. Let's see the next. So unbeknownst to us, we actually got an indication from Alpha in flight. Not only was the wing hit, but there was an almost surgical slice of the tail. And in a way, that was probably more threatening to our safety than anything. But it was just this thin slice that was taken off, and as the investigation proceeded, it became obvious how it unfolded. But as the NTSB said to us, you were probably less than an inch separated you surviving or dying. And for the people on the Boeing, on the Gol Airlines airplane, it was probably a matter of a few feet. It was that close. And again, when you think of a closure rate of 1,000 miles an hour at 37,000 feet, it's just it's still staggering to me that we were able to walk away, or that the 154 people came that close to being able to walk away. Another view of the tail. These were taken at the military base that we landed on and spent the next 24 hours, 28 hours after landing. Close-up view of the winglet. I have that when the aircraft was restored to flight over the course of the next year after the accident. Constant Aviation in Cleveland presented Ralph and me with portions of the airplane that they removed. And I have that in a frame in my office as a constant. Not that I need a constant reminder, but it is a constant reminder every single day. And seeing in my office is also intended to be a reminder to everybody I work with of how high the stakes are that we're involved with, and a reminder of when things go wrong, how wrong they can go. And it's interesting because it makes some people very uncomfortable. I've worked with people who every time they walk into my office, they just shake their head. And I had one gentleman who would say, "I don't know how I feel about seeing that there." And I said, well, if it makes you uncomfortable, then it's doing its job, because we should always be in a state of treating everything we do as, we can't be complacent. We can't treat any flight as routine. We have to have our eyes and ears and senses open to the fact that no matter how much we plan, no matter how much we do, the outcome is not always in our control. A close-up view of the leading edge of the wing, and it's interesting because you think of the impact that sheared off part of the winglet, and yet the lens for the navigation light is unscathed. Yet next to it, you see that leading edge separation, and it's again, it was an event of inches that kept that wing on, that kept that tail intact enough for us to land safely. That was the last shot I took before we left the military base the day after the accident. And it would be well over a year before I got to visit that airplane in Cleveland as it was being restored for to be sold to an operator in Mexico. That is again from Flight International. It's just a graphic of what the collision was, and really what it was the winglet of the Boeing 737-800 shaving our tail. That's the damage you saw to the tail, and hitting our wing, their wing colliding with our wing. The unfortunate thing for the Boeing was that the winglet of the Legacy is structural. So it's not a piece that could just break away and cause a little bit of in-flight upset. It sliced the bottom of the Boeing wing, which failed, and minutes later, the Boeing crashed into the ground from 37,000 feet. So I used to speak a lot more about the accident when it was more recent, and those are a picture of my daughters. Just as a reminder that the reason we do all this is to come home to people like that in our lives. And I never want to lose sight of the fact that that I was fortunate enough to come home to them, and there were many people who didn't have that same blessing. So, but the criminalization aspect, which I know we'll go further into as we talk, began almost immediately after the accident, and we were unaware. I'll say we were unaware, we were unprepared for that possibility, and I think somewhat naive in our approach to the accident and its aftermath. So the first people, so we stayed at the military base for 24 to 30 hours. We were talked to by various people, most of whom didn't identify themselves to us. And we were very guarded because we didn't even realize there was an actual collision with another airplane until a few hours after we landed at the base. And we were sitting eating dinner, just speculating wildly about what could have happened. And Daniel Bachman, who was our only Portuguese-speaking member of our party, came to the table and said, "Guys, I have bad news." He said, "There's an airliner missing." And that's when the mood of the whole experience, going from this adrenaline-charged feeling of survival to this sense of tragedy, it shifted at that moment, and we still didn't have a clear sense of what had happened until the next morning, because even in the barracks that we stayed in overnight, there was no source of news. We had no internet access. We were so remotely located that our phones didn't work. We were at the mercy of the people who ran the base to get brief access to their computers, to email, and to try to figure out what happened. But there was no true information about what happened until the next morning, when we were told that the airliner had crashed to the floor of the Amazon. And so after going through the day of questioning, they separated the pilots and Ralph Michelli from us. They went back to the airplane. Henry and Joe and I, Joe Sharkey and I, were left behind to just sort of kill time because we had nothing to do. When we finally got off the base, we were brought to a federal police station in a place called Cuiabá. And the very first people who formally spoke to us about what happened were from the Brazilian federal police. And again, it was a wake-up call, because we realized that this was automatically and immediately being investigated as a possible crime. And the dynamic in the police station was something we were unaccustomed to. First of all, because whatever country you're from, you know what rights you have in that country. You know what rights you have to representation. If you're an American citizen, you're entitled to a lawyer, you're entitled to make calls. But that really, it was uncharted territory for us. We didn't have an attorney on site, Embraer did. We had the US Air Force attaché to Brazil, who was present and trying to give us what counsel he could, but he wasn't a lawyer, and he wasn't there. He was there in a capacity to protect the interests of the United States government, as opposed to the 7 of us on this airplane. And it was a startling wake-up call. Here we are, we had been in this trauma the day before. Now we're going through the night being interrogated, it sounds like an intimidating word, but it really was an interrogation. And just so everybody's prepared for what can happen in a criminalization event, you're at everybody else's mercy to a degree. The more remote you are, if there's a language barrier, you really are not in any sense of control. And we all like to feel we have a sense of control this is probably a situation that I've felt the least amount of control in a professional setting that I ever did. So we were questioned in Portuguese, and present in the room I was being questioned in were the U.S. Air Force attaché and a representative of Embraer. So it wasn't a sterile situation by any means. So the federal policeman asked us questions in Portuguese. It was translated by a translator. I would answer, and then the transcriptionist would translate it for the federal police. And this went on for a long period of time. And at the end of this process, and I just told the truth. I told the truth of what I knew, of what happened. They asked questions like, were the pilots out of the cockpit during this portion of the flight? Which they were not. And at the end of the questioning, I was given a document in Portuguese and asked to sign it. That was supposed to be a representation of our conversation. And so I turned to the Air Force gentleman and I said, I can't sign this. I don't understand what it says. He said, let me take a look at it. So he took a look at it and he said, yeah, this is a fair representation of what you said. I said, I'm still uncomfortable signing it because, you know, it's your word against my understanding versus whatever is being done here. So he said, well, why don't you sign it? And right next to your signature, I don't read, write, or speak Portuguese. It seemed reasonable at the time, so I did it. I directed everybody else in our party who didn't speak Portuguese to do that.
So David, hold up right there because I want to bring Mark into this conversation. Obviously, in a perfect world, you'd have somebody at the other end of the phone and getting a lot of really good information. But Mark, I want to turn this over to you now based upon what David has brought us to. What would be your recommendations and what would be happening on a legal end if you were representing somebody like this?
Excuse me, I think David raises a very good point in terms of signing things. You know, as I often describe it, after an accident occurs, a number of separate, independent, albeit related investigations and inquiries start taking place. Obviously, as David has related, one of them that they experienced was essentially a criminal investigation that was pretty clearly being conducted by the police. There's also, you know, obviously an accident investigation that has started. There is probably a regulatory investigation of some sort regarding the operator and whatever certifications the operator has. Then you have all of the other avenues of inquiry that are taking place, whether it's the media, the 24/7 media, which is voraciously hungry to report and or speculate. You've got your employees, current employees, former employees. You've got civil litigation that is being teed up somewhere by somebody. But one of the things, and this is true, as David pointed out, in the context of if you're sitting in Brazil and the Amazon, or if you're sitting in the United States, is you're being asked to sign certain things. And that's true in the context of the accident investigation as well as, in this case, the criminal investigation. Our advice always, one is obviously, and I hope this is obvious, is read things before you sign them and make sure you understand them. When in fact you don't speak the language that the document is written in and you have no way of understanding what's there, it's really, from our advice perspective, no different than if you're presented with a summary, somebody else's summary of your interview that has just taken place, and you're being asked to sign it. Our experience over the years is that frequently, when you go back and look at that document that you signed, I'll call it in the heat of the moment or in the context of the investigation, you look at it and you say, I don't think that's right, or that's not complete, or that's not characterized properly, yet your signature is on it. And so our advice is if you have to sign something, say, I've been presented this, just as David said, I don't read this language, I don't understand this language, but I am signing it because I have been asked to sign it. Even if things are in English, our advice in the context of an NTSB investigation or any investigation, when the investigator presents to you your statement or a summary of your statement that was just given in the context of a discussion, our advice is basically read it. If it's not complete, indicate that I don't believe the statement is complete, or I reserve the right to amend this statement, or I disagree with portions of this statement, and then sign it. That gives you 6 months from now, 6 weeks from now, in the future, it gives you the opportunity to say, look, I signed it because I was asked to sign it. I didn't agree with it. I didn't understand all of it. I hadn't had an opportunity to think about it, and so forth. One thing I would note, if any of you have been or get involved in accident investigations in the United States, they take statements from all the air traffic controllers. And all air traffic control statements that I can recall seeing have a modifier in them. They're all signed by the air traffic controller who's giving the statement, but they all have the modifier that says, I reserve the right to amend or correct this statement in the future. And that is actually not a bad thing in terms of if you're being asked to sign something. Ideally, you're in a position to decline to sign something, but when you're sitting there, as David has related, in the Amazon with the federal police surrounding you, and there's nobody really looking out for your interests, I think the kind of signature that Dave gave you in terms of that modifier is entirely appropriate, because the key is you want to, give them what they want and get out of there as quickly as possible. Barb?
Thank you so much. David, back to you. Now you've just signed something that you don't understand, and you have to try and find a way out of that country. What type of assistance were you getting from your government?
Sorry, there's not a connection problem. I was just mulling how to answer that politely. So, as I said, we were a little bit naive. And I think some of the people on the ground from the US government might have been a little naive too. My belief had always been that as an American traveling abroad, that if I needed assistance, that I could count on the consulate or the embassy to ride in like the cavalry and rescue us. And it's much more complex than that. So if you're a citizen traveling abroad and in trouble, you're an inconvenience. No matter what country, you're still an inconvenience to the smooth order of business of the consulate and the embassy. Policy is not dictated in country, it's dictated in Washington. You have to look at the context of everything else going on in the world to understand that, you're easily collateral damage to whatever the other priorities of your government are. So the support we got from the government was they showed up when we were flown back to the factory town after the federal police investigation, questioning. We were met by people from the consulate. They were very very nice. They tried to facilitate our stay and to make things easy. And they came to us with a letter from the Brazilian government saying, once the pilots complete their ICAO required questioning and physical examination, they will be free to leave the country. We all put our belief in that. And obviously that it was probably correct when the letter was written.
Mm-hmm.
It was probably written by people who didn't control the situation enough to be able to make that claim. So, my impression of the US government, and we just at the aviation symposium that Mark hosts every year, and gives me the privilege to speak at. I was talking to somebody from the State Department about what happened. And I said I was just a little surprised that when the pilots' passports were seized, it was facilitated by representatives of the U.S. consulate, which I guess technically is within their sphere, although I always thought that our passports were the property of the US government, and that they would hold them in trust, but they were the ones facilitating the transfer of the passports. And one of the things that was most striking to me that when we were at a different military base for the ICAO examinations to take place is the government representative said to me, "You're lucky this happened in a country of laws," which certainly gave me pause because it didn't feel like a proper process was playing out. Yet what they were trying to say was, trust us. There are places in the world that could be much worse. And I know that, I understand that. But at one point I asked, after the pilots lost their passports, I said, so if they feel in danger in any way, of imprisonment or of violence on the street, can we just show up at the door of the embassy and you'll let us in and you'll protect them? And without saying no, they said no. Which I thought was the last card we could play if we needed that kind of assistance. And what they're really saying was, you're a little bit on your own here. We'll do what we can. And sort of my sarcastic joke when the pilots were finally released, and I'm sort of fast forwarding here, and I was told, and this exact quote stays with me 19 years later, the pilots will have the full support of the US government in helping them leave the country. And I said, by full support, is that coffee and donuts? I'm not sure what support you're saying because we don't feel supported here. So there's nobody that can look after your interests as well as you can. There's nobody who will. The context of world events was that Chavez in Venezuela was railing against the US. President Lula was standing for re-election, and Chavez was sort of pointing fingers at him, saying that he was a puppet of the US government or complicit with them. And we had a fresh war in the Middle East. So a couple of pilots of a plush business jet, who by all accounts looked like they were in a really bad place and had done things wrong and resulted in a lot of deaths. We were not the most sympathetic story. And so it was hard to find friends. And we had to create friendships and advocate for ourselves because we couldn't count on anybody else to do that.
David,
What was the local media coverage? Oh, sorry, Al. What was the local media coverage like? Were you under stress from all of that as well?
It was brutal. It was brutal and it was immediate. And I think that 24/7 media has just gotten more competitive and more brutal than it was back then. Obviously, it was a terrible tragedy. It was a terrible loss of life. And nothing I say should be misconstrued as minimizing that suffering or that tragedy. But because people die in an accident doesn't automatically make you guilty or culpable. And I was scolded at another one of Mark's symposiums by somebody from the NTSB saying I was not sympathetic enough to what happened in Brazil. And what I said to him privately was, we didn't have to pay the price with our pilots' lives going to a Brazilian jail. So I'm not going to apologize for a strong defense of our pilots. But the media, it starts with speculation. It gets it gets multiplied by misinformation. Then interested parties like plaintiffs' attorneys or wannabe plaintiffs' attorneys get involved and continue to stoke the flames. And then you add politicians. And, you know, I always think that the path towards criminalization starts with the politicians. And it's the most dangerous part of the dialogue. So you have this media machine that's spinning out of control on its own. We're unable to speak to the media to defend ourselves in a proper way. There aren't enough facts out to come to conclusions, so people come to their own conclusions. And then there's a conversation with the insurance company and with the NTSB and with the Brazilian investigators about what you can and can't do. So again, it's not a normal conversation. It's not a normal fight to protect your name and your reputation, because you need these other people. You need the insurance company to write checks. You need the NTSB to keep you as a party to the investigation. And you need to try not to inflame passions of the people who control your fate and your freedom. So it's a lethal mix. And some people who don't understand the media believe that you just don't say anything. But the problem is there are so many people ready to fill the vacuum that you leave by not speaking, that the damage they did in the early days of post-accident has lasted to this day. It's lasted in terms of the criminal charges, in terms of the reputational damage, in terms of the financial damages, and in terms of the perceptions of the loved ones left behind. And that can never be undone. So the media was just brutal. And as somebody who spent the first half of my career in media, I never understood why people hated, disrespected, or mistrusted the media. Then at the center of the storm, I kind of figured it out.
David, I have
Marie.
a question. And firstly, I just want to say, we've spoken about this before. You were in a complete damned if you do, damned if you don't situation anyway when it comes to communications, because you were in a position where you had to defend, work with authorities. You've got you've had your own difficult situation, trying to keep your crew safe or protected, and being in the middle of the mid-air collision versus then showing the compassion and the, like you said, that the understanding for what others were going through. But you were in the middle of that. Whatever you would have done, it would not have been enough. But my question to you really, and I remember someone else asking you this previously, was I'm sort of asking you this on behalf of our airline clients. So some of them have in their plans, of course, get a lawyer down there as quickly as you possibly can. But many also go, let's get our team out as quickly as we possibly can. And I remember you answering that difficult choice that you had. Do you stay or do you try to get out? Can you just talk us through your thinking there?
Sure. And I've spoken, we've talked about it, and a lot of people have said, well, I would just get my crew out. I've had people from the NTSB say, my advice to people is just get out. And that's fine, but it's an oversimplification given the dynamics on the ground. When we remember, this happened on a Friday night in a remote place in Brazil. So our first brush with our own legal representation was Monday morning. And we had dinner with the attorney. So that was the first questioning by the CENIPA, which is the Brazilian investigative body. So the pilots were questioned. We went to dinner with our first attorney down there. And during dinner, I got a call from my headquarters saying, we've been told that the passports are going to be seized tomorrow at the ICAO part of this inquiry. So I went back to the dinner table and I said to the lawyer, I've just been informed that the pilots are going to lose their passports tomorrow. And he basically said, don't worry about it. Everything's fine. There's nothing to worry about. So in the taxi ride back to the hotel, I said to the pilots, guys, we have to have a serious conversation. This moment is the last opportunity to get out of the country. So we would have to come up with a really quick plan, get out of here. And we have to understand what the implications of getting out are. The implications are that evidence could disappear, that the court of public opinion turns further, that it exposes you to other actions when we get back to the US. And most importantly, where we cross to get out could threaten your very liberty. So we didn't know how united the Brazilian government effort was to control the situation was. So I said, probably, if we're going to leave the country, we should probably not go to the US directly, because that's what they're going to be watching for. And if we're caught trying to get out, and I say we, I was not in jeopardy at this point, just they were, then they might put you directly in jail.
Mhm.
And it's much easier to fight this being out of jail. We always believed the truth would win out, but the idea of getting out of the country sounds nice, but it's really not a practical solution, because the risk you take, evidence can disappear, that's fine. The court of public opinion can turn against you, that's fine. But if the risk is your liberty and having to fight from a Brazilian prison, after the defense minister of Brazil has told the entire country that these 2 US pilots of this fancy business jet just killed 154 of your countrymen, I can think of nothing more dangerous they could have been exposed to. So we made the decision, believing the truth would win out, to stick it out. There was no right answer. I mean, would things have been different if we were able to get out? Maybe. But I think that the conclusion of, the most fortunate thing is that they never saw the inside of a jail.
I remember you saying it would have been easier. It was easier for you to defend yourself from a hotel room than it would have been from a jail cell.
Or even from the United States, because as few friends as we could find in the immediate days after the accident, because the facts looked like they were not in our favor. And as they were influenced by plaintiffs' attorneys and Brazilian officials, we just didn't look so great. And so it was hard to get support from politicians in the United States. And we had very deep connections to some elected officials. Being in the United States looking like we ran out in the dark of night would have made it that much more difficult to find people to defend us.
Mhm. Mark, what are your thoughts on this? Because that would certainly be something that airlines would be looking to you for advice.
I think David has given a really, really good explanation of the thought process. And I wish I could say that there's a right answer or a wrong answer. And the fact of the matter is, there is no right or wrong answer. It's a function of circumstance. And I think from the perspective of airlines, for example, that are scheduled, know where they're going, have a schedule in place and so forth, airlines are in a position to be a lot more prepared in many respects than charter operators may be. I'm sure that before David and the XLAir team took off from the United States, they didn't go look and see what are the processes in Brazil in terms of the criminalization of aviation accidents and so forth. There's no need to. But when you are a scheduled operator, you should not only understand what the accident investigation processes and procedures are throughout the world in which you operate, those countries into which you operate, but also what is the nature of criminalization in that particular country. Because I think understanding that just as an institutional matter, as part of your emergency preparedness, is essential. Outside the United States, criminalization of aviation accidents is much more the norm than it is in the United States. It is criminal investigations of aviation accidents oftentimes take precedent outside the United States and are conducted by judicial authorities. So I think that if you're an international operator, either operating from outside the United States throughout the rest of the world or into the United States, quite frankly, there's no excuse to not understand what you are getting yourself into and what you are getting your crew into. And I think given the object lesson that David has laid out for us, as well as other events that have taken place since that time, every operator, including charter operators, should understand what they are getting into. The question is, in terms of getting a crew out, if you talk to the pilot unions, their position is, we want our crew flown out of there. We want our members flown out of there. But as David says, what happens, and it wasn't so true certainly with XLair, what happens if you're an airline and you have employees on the ground who are permanently based in that particular country? What happens to your ability to operate in and out of that country in the future if you have flown your crew out after an accident? Are the government authorities going to cut off your operating rights? Are government authorities going to endanger your other ground employees that are on the ground there? Should you continue to operate into that country until things are sorted out? Your pilots may be back in your home country, but there are lots of issues that still remain open. So I'll give you an example of something that we have done in the context of a global operator who's operating into 60 countries, 60 countries, 24 hours a day. There is literally a volume about that thick that has by country a summary of how they investigate accidents in terms of what their accident investigation procedures are, the role and nature of criminalization in that country, a summary of some of the relevant laws that would apply to an operator, an airline operating into that country, who investigates the accident itself, contact information for the embassy of the country. David said the consular services and so forth, although he's absolutely right in terms of the preparation and knowledge of, at least in the case of the U.S. State Department and consular services, of their role or lack of role. But also, one of the things we have done is we have identified lawyers in every one of the 60 countries who are knowledgeable regarding the aviation system within that country. And not just law firms, but individual lawyers within law firms as appropriate, so that in the event an issue presents itself, there are people who can be immediately available for that client outside the United States. In some respects, it's unfortunate, but David's experience, I think, demonstrates the utility of something like that. Not to say that the advice of the lawyer would have been any different in terms of get your crew out of here, but we've all heard the saying is act first and apologize later. And I think that one thing David hasn't said, David, why don't you tell everybody, how long was it before the pilots got out of the country? And what sort of, criminal penalties were sort of hanging over their heads, or perhaps even to this day hang over their heads?
So I believe the number is 67 days before they got their passports back and were able to leave the country. And the only way that we got the passports back was through the courts, because there was the courts found that, and a succession of courts found that there was nothing in Brazilian law that provided for them to be able to seize the passports while the investigation was ongoing. So it was a long period of time, and we were very mindful of the fact that they were at the risk at any moment of an angry judge putting them in jail. And that was our fear for all 67 days. And by the way, from the time of the ICAO questioning to their departure from the country, there were 0 other interrogations that took place. The investigators didn't talk to them again, either from the federal police or from SANIPA. And it was a painful period. It was a scary period. In fact, we had a conversation with a former secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, because we wanted to make sure that, and we had 24/7 security surrounding the pilots, and did what we could to protect them from a distance. We had local attorneys, including the firm of, and to Mark's point, getting the right people in country was crucial to slowing down the rush to adjudicating all of this. And we wound up with the firm of the former defense minister of Brazil. And that sent a signal to everybody who were going to make quick work of the pilots that not so fast, that we may not have a lot of experience here, but we at least have enough savvy to hire the right people who understand the system and who know the players and who can slow down at least the rush to judgment without any kind of protection to us. But the notion that, I'm sorry, we spoke to try to protect them, and our number one goal was, we wanted to continue our business because 150 people depended on us for a paycheck, and we didn't want to become a commercial victim of the accident. So we met with the former Homeland Security secretary, and he said chilling words. All these things are very chilling, and I remember him as if it happened yesterday. He said, "Now, I can't do anything. My team can't do anything to keep, your pilots out of jail. But if they do go to jail, I think we can keep them safe inside jail." And you just shake your head, because there's a lot of people who are in former government positions who are now consulting. And, this was one of those individuals. And we just walked away shaking our heads thinking, we have to be able to do better than this to protect our guys. And you really are at the mercy of, and every time we defended ourselves in the media in Brazil and the lawyers became incensed. And so we were very cautious, because it turned up the heat even further. There's just nothing but landmines. And as a small company, as a small operator, we were at the mercy, I think, of circumstances and lack of preparation more than a major scheduled airline might be. But at the end of the day, if you're trying to smuggle a guy who was involved in an accident and who lost his passport, they still have to pass through passport control to get back on your airplane, to get out.
Yeah.
So, and as Mark said, the exposure to the people in country who become the surrogates if you do get out is other risk. So I think the size of the company doesn't assure your safety or well-being, and you just have to be strategic and deal with circumstances that change by the minute.
Marie.
David, also again for our airline clients and ERP managers, there's been a question sort of asking what can we do to avoid the world assuming guilt. And I sort of answered the question saying this is almost physically impossible, but I'd like to bring it up. My answer was to really have everything in place, resources, plans, training to be able to deal with a situation like this. And what I suggested was legal counsel, emergency response plans, crisis communications plans. So that is almost like a stock standard. But in your view, if this happened and, you were, you're the leadership of the company, so I know that you were there and the support that you would have given your crew. But what did they need? What can emergency response planning managers have in place to look after the pilots while they're going through this, look after their concerned families, just from a real personal mental health and practical level? What do you think made a difference to them?
I think knowing that we were fully supportive of protecting them, that was the mission for 67 days, was to keep them out of harm's way to the extent we could. We supported their families. We flew their families down to visit them in the hotel in which they were staying. I think they just knew that we weren't just going to cut them loose and leave them to their own devices. During this whole process, to complicate matters further, we received a reservation of rights letter from our insurance company, which said basically that because there's a criminal investigation and the policy excludes criminality under coverage, we reserve the right not to cover you anymore for the defense of the pilots. And I can tell you that was a bitter pill to swallow, yet we had no choice. We had to continue to work with all the interested parties. And what we learned quickly was the importance of advocating for ourselves. So we went into this insufficiently prepared for a complex international operation. We had the technical expertise, but I think having a lawyer in every country we fly to was a missed opportunity, as Mark referred to. You need somebody on speed dial, or your insurance company needs somebody on speed dial who you can reach any hour of night and day, because accidents don't tend to happen in the most convenient times or in the most convenient places. And they don't follow a fact pattern, even with an emergency response plan or drill. That's just muscle memory, but then you have to react to the actual circumstances. So having an attorney on speed dial would have helped us. But I think that we became very strong advocates for our own position. And that included media management, that we weren't going to be passive in the face of anybody who wasn't looking after our interests. And so we got a keen ear to people who either were wavering or softening or felt that we shouldn't respond to things. We had somebody at the insurance company who said, just don't respond to the media, it's going to go away. They're like, no. And they had this gun to our head with the reservation of rights letter. We felt that we had a gun to our head, because if we displeased them, we were afraid that they were just going to not cover the $500,000 lawyer bill just for the drop of the first tick of the meter, just to get representation. That was what it took to engage them. So again, you're trying to keep everybody close, but you're also having to manage all these outside forces, while also never losing sight of the need to advocate for your employees, for their families, and for your own interests, and not to become passive about people taking shots, because everybody takes shots. It feels like everybody's analyzed, everybody's an armchair expert. We became very adept at controlling the message, and got to the point where if the media got a story wrong, we were on them immediately to get them to fix it, because we couldn't allow somebody else to control our narrative. Only you have to control the narrative, and you have to get the best people in place to advocate for you, understanding that no matter how big you are or how small you are somewhat powerless to control circumstances. So you have to try to influence them as best you can.
Mark?
Yeah, no, let me add a couple things. One, the significance of understanding what you as an operator, charter operator or scheduled airline operator are subjecting yourself to when you fly into another country. Well, not only another country, but your own country even. What are the procedures? What are the limitations? So forth and so on. For example, if the accident is in the United States, the NTSB will conduct the investigation. However, at the same time, you're going to have, as we've talked about, plaintiffs' lawyers pursuing cases and trying to improve their position and get more cases. You're going to have a regulatory investigation of your operations in the United States, whether you're a certificate holder or not, an FAA certificate holder or not. You're going to have a criminal investigation. Now, interestingly, in the United States, the criminal investigation could be conducted by the federal criminal authorities, U.S. Attorney's Office, FBI, Inspector Generals. It can be a state prosecutor. It can be a local prosecutor. And quite frankly, and I think this is probably true throughout the world, any conduct by a pilot that we might otherwise characterize as a mistake, as just civil negligence, can in fact be converted into criminal conduct, negligent homicide, and can be the subject of a federal criminal indictment, for example. So the fact that it's not criminal in the traditional sense that we may think about doesn't mean that some prosecutor, whether in the United States or outside the United States, is not looking at it for, quite frankly, their 15 minutes within the spotlight. So it's our advice always is understand the system in which you are operating and be prepared to deal with it in advance. Understand what you're going to do. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to get your pilots, assuming they survive, outside of the country as quickly as possible and then deal with the consequences later. But understand that is going to be one of the first questions. And oftentimes, it's a function of what country the accident occurs in. That really you have the ability to know before, if you're a scheduled operation well in advance, or even in most charter operations. Certainly 19 years ago, when David experienced what he's laid out for us, you didn't have sort of the same atmosphere of criminalization. Right now, all of you are probably aware, obviously, that the Boeing company is experiencing a great deal of criminal activity. And just a day before yesterday, essentially the judge that's overseeing the criminal proceedings against Boeing set a trial for June 23rd when Boeing indicated that they perhaps are not prepared to go forward with a plea deal or a plea agreement that they had previously agreed to. So there is potentially, well, I won't say potentially, the trial is set for June 23rd of the criminal charges against the Boeing company. Additionally, wholly unrelated, there are involuntary manslaughter, negligent homicide charges pending against a flight instructor who, during an instructional flight, the airplane crashed, his student died, and a federal grand jury has indicted the flight instructor for negligent homicide. So we're talking about something that is present in every single case. So one of the pieces of advice we give, in addition to understanding the systems in which you're operating, the role of criminalization, how the pieces all fit together and so forth, is well, as a practical matter, I recently learned that as a U.S. citizen, you can get a second copy of your passport. So even if you have to surrender your passport, you'll still have one in your back pocket. And I have a feeling that the airline, the unions recently learned that as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if most airline pilots who fly throughout the world are getting second copies of their passport. But understand how the criminal system overlays with respect to any event that happens any place in the world. And as David said, and certainly as we recommend, identify lawyers and have them on board, have conflicts cleared, make sure they understand the system, and have them available 24/7. Our client had an airplane a few years ago run off the runway in Kazakhstan. We got a phone call during that 24/7 time frame in the middle of the night saying they had this problem. The two pilots were uninjured. The authorities are surrounding the airplane. They won't let us move it. We immediately contacted the lawyer we had identified in Kazakhstan, who was on the scene within an hour. And within another hour, that airplane was back on the runway and taking off, because we had people involved who understood the system and were able to intervene before the momentum had built up in the system that it was worse than it could have been. Now, obviously, that was not a situation where you had fatalities, and I wish I could say that had all the steps that David and I talked about vis-a-vis his experience been taken in advance, that the circumstances would have been any different, or that the control would have been greater. But the fact is, I think there would have been a greater awareness on the part of any operator who finds himself in that circumstance of what to expect. Again, I think the immediate question that's going to be asked, and I certainly get it, is what do we do about the pilots? Do we get them out of the country? And I don't think that's a question that can be answered in advance of the event occurring. I think you can understand what circumstances you're flying them into and that they're flying into, and what the consequences may be, and how to manage getting them out of the country. But in terms of saying we're absolutely going to have charter operators standing by, or we're going to have vehicles ready to drive them across the border and so forth, I don't think you want to pull that trigger until the circumstances really start to present themselves.
And Mark, you may remember when I was working at a previous airline, we had this conversation because there were 110 people in the room, and I posed this to everyone, that we've had an accident in a country where criminalization is going to occur. And as you stated, everybody has a different idea of what should happen, because the union representative for the pilots said, get the pilots out. That's the knee-jerk reaction. We're immediately taking them to the airport. We're getting them out of there.
Right.
And the question that I posed then, what about the flight attendants? Because it's a commercial airline. Now, what have you just done to your flight attendants who may be held hostage there? And their union representative then speaks up. So what we were looking at in terms of mitigating strategies were that if something like this were to occur, we would want to immediately get the union representatives, the legal teams, the insurers together in a conference bridge to start discussing it, so that you don't have people making decisions in a silo that could affect the overall safety for the people that are remaining in country. Elle-Marie, were there some questions that?
Yes, I've got a few questions. There's about three, two for Mark, I'm guessing, and one for you, David. But before I go into that, I just actually wanted to read out. We're speaking about Brazil and the US, and there's many countries that don't or that prioritize safety above criminalization, but unless there's criminal intent. But I looked up countries with a known history of this, and I thought that this will be interesting. What came up was Brazil, and particularly the Gulf accident, David, that you were involved in. Indonesia, Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Egypt, and Mexico. And I know that this is not an exhaustive list, but I thought that would be an interesting thing to consider if you operate in and out of those countries. And a few more, Mark, like you said, the big manual that you have. You're definitely the one that I would have on speed dial. So I'm going to plug your services here, Mark, because honestly, but okay, let me quickly go to the questions. So we've got one from Rhonda saying, this is for David. how was the crew's mental state? And did they feel supported? I think you mentioned how you support them, but how did they, what were they going through?
I think that their mental state, they seem to they seem to stay positive throughout the time. You know, they knew what the jeopardy they were in. We had an attorney down there, PR people in place. We had multiple attorneys, both there and here. They had criminal attorneys involved. So I think they felt as supported as they could. I think they were trying to stay as positive as they could. Um, you know, as positive as you can stay, living with this hanging over your head for 67 days, trying to get out of country and stay safe and stay hopeful that nothing was going to turn, because if it turned, it was going to turn quickly, all while dealing with the trauma that we dealt with of having survived this accident.
You know, David, let me add something, make an observation. Um, as you mentioned, we and I think Marie mentioned, we have our aviation symposium every year, and we've done panels on criminalization. And in preparation, putting together the panels, I had an opportunity to talk to one of the two pilots. I won't identify which one, about being on the panel. And talking about his experience and the kinds of things that were going through his mind and so forth. And he was not comfortable participating in the panel. And I think part of it was he didn't want to relive the experience. But I think the other part of it that I took away from the discussions is he did not want to insert himself into any sort of spotlight that might result in repercussions either from the Brazilian government or through the State Department, the US State Department, that drew attention even almost 20 years later. So I think it was permanently, and I think we can all understand this because this is an experience, a life experience that's permanently imprinted on your brain and your being and you. I think this pretty clearly is permanently imprinted on him, and he just doesn't want to go there and do that anymore, so to speak. It was kind of an interesting discussion.
Now I'm curious who that was.
I've got a couple of questions. One is from Johan Leroux asking, would it be different so I'll read the whole question. Given the uncertainty, risk, and unpreparedness as narrated by David, can it be said that the temperature of such a possible event has been turned down, or in the unlikely event of a similar situation, would affected parties be faced with the same hurdles and challenges 20 years later? So if this happened now, would this be the same, Mark?
Yeah, I think it's the same. I think the difference is that there's no excuse for being unprepared now. I think all the challenges are going to remain the same. All the circumstances will remain the same. And a lot of the decision making, in fact, perhaps all the decision making is going to remain the same. It's just a function of not having to confront it or think about it after the event occurs. I'm sure that, before they took off from the United States, David and his colleagues did not sit around a table and say, well, what happens if we have an accident in Brazil? How are we going to deal with the media? How are we going to deal with the criminal authorities? What about the investigation and so forth? Now, our advice to everybody that we represent and everybody that we talk to is, if you know where you're going to operate into, and it's not always the case with some charter operators in particular, where you're called on to make an emergency flight, whether medical or otherwise. But if you know where you're going to operate into, you should understand what you're getting yourself into in terms of the accident investigation rules and procedures in that country, including the United States, the role of criminalization in that country, including the United States, what you can say and what you can't say, legal counsel availability, and so forth. all the decisions are ultimately going to be the same in terms of you're going to have to confront the decision-making process, but you will have all the pieces at the table right away. One piece of advice I give everybody is that if you are going to run emergency response training, tabletop exercises, if you've got an emergency response program, handbook, make sure you have sections in there and parts of your tabletops that deal with the criminalization aspect. You may not be able to make the decision until it really presents itself as to whether you fly your crew out of the country, but be sure you consider all of the elements, whether it's the flight attendants, whether it's in-country employees, so forth, whether or not Brazil is going to allow you to operate into the country anymore if you pull your employees out of that country. So all of the decisions, all the questions are going to be the same. You really can't pre-decide them in advance.
I found that, you know, in the decision-making process when airlines are going into new destinations, the emergency response aspects aren't all that high, you know, in the priority level. It's mainly marketing driven, operationally driven, and then somewhere down the list, there might be something about emergency response there. But I think it's important that in those safety risk assessments that they include that piece into this, and also have those discussions with your code share partners as well, because it gets complex when you have an accident in a foreign country and you've got code shares. Again, it's so important to include those, and yet in many code share agreements, emergency response is really not a priority. So it's important that if you are an ER planner, that you make that a priority, talk to your legal teams, talk to your insurers, make sure that those decisions are being looked at ahead of time when you're making the choice of which destinations you're going into.
We've got a few more questions. One is, let me see which one I can ask. Question for Mark from Timothy Bishop. For airlines with mature safety management systems and aviation safety action programs, it is status quo to provide the FAA open access to airline publications, records, and facilities. In the light of recent FAA and NTSB actions providing investigation data to the DOJ, and then the DOJ actions issuing subpoenas and conducting arraignments against Boeing and Alaska Airlines, if an accident or incident could result in criminalization of airline actions, should an airline be more restrictive of FAA access pre and post incident? Wow, that's a mouthful. I hope you made sense of that, Mark.
No, I sort of think I get it. I think if you are operating under the aegis of the FAA, if you're a U.S. certificated operation, a Part 121 operator, Part 135 operator, or you're a non-U.S. operator operating into the United States and being subjected to the oversight and control of the FAA, you know, it's very difficult to say no to the FAA. That's certainly true if you're certificated by the FAA, because inherent within the certification are certain agreements that you obligate yourself to. But I think it's very important that you, one, in the absence of an accident or an incident giving rise to what might logically be a request for information from the FAA, one has to understand why the FAA is requesting certain information. We just had a client that had a request, in this case, from the NTSB. They want to talk to some pilots. There was no accident. There was no incident as defined by the NTSB. There's an event, but it doesn't fall, as best we can tell, within the purview of the investigatory authority of the NTSB. So the question that we have told our client to go back to the NTSB with is, what is the purpose of this inquiry, and is this being treated as an accident or an incident, and why is it being treated that way? What we're hoping is those questions educate the NTSB to understand that they don't have the authority to do what they are asking to do. So we're taking it a step at a time. I think the first thing to do is understand exactly what the basis of the request is. Is there an event that gives rise to the request? And there, I think the first stop would be the FAA authorities who oversee your certificate if you're a U.S. operator, or if you're operating into the United States, that part of the FAA that oversees that sort of operation. If you don't get a satisfactory answer, I think we typically escalate it to flight standards in Washington. I think any document that you provide, whether you're a U.S. operator or an operator operating into the United States, to the FAA should have certain information or certain legends placed on it. And the legends ought to be proprietary and confidential, not to be released under the Freedom of Information Act. The reason is that any information that you provide to the government, unless it has that legend on every page, is releasable to the public under the Freedom of Information Act. And you can read public as including lawyers. However, if that legend is on every page, the FAA then has to go back to you, to the company, and say, we've had a request for A, B, and C. Can we release it? And they cannot release it without going back to the company. So I think the first step, as I said, is understanding why the request is being made before any documentation is turned over. Our experience is that oftentimes that sort of blunts the request or makes it go away, or they can't come up with a good reason, or it gives a basis to escalate to the next level of the FAA. But I think a lot of this is situationally driven. So I think that's the best answer I can give you sort of in the abstract.
I just want to let everyone know that this is the end of the webinar, but we are going to continue here. So if you're able to still stay with us, we'd welcome you to continue to join us in the conversation.
Shall we ask a few more questions? Also bearing in mind, David, that Mark, you may not want to stay forever, but while we've got you, we want to sort of hold you as a captive audience, giving free legal advice, Mark. So Nick Orwen, good friend of mine, asked, we're in a period of geopolitical instability, and clearly an aircraft accident can easily become a political incident, which we've obviously seen many, many times over. Should airlines or operators be more cautious in their decisions to fly to certain parts of the world right now?
Well, let me take a crack at it, and I'll say, just as a general matter, yes. I think the issue of being cautious, you have this competing concern about the business considerations of providing air traffic or airline service into certain parts of the world versus what are the potential consequences of doing so or not doing so. I think I would defer that to the business people and the security people that have their finger on the pulse, hopefully, of the security situation in that part of the world. But what I would say is there's absolutely no excuse for not being prepared. If the decision is made to operate into XYZ country, understand what the system is that you are operating into. Understand where the criminal process resides in the hierarchy of investigation. Understand what the investigatory rules. David's mentioned ICAO. Accidents are investigated under ICAO Annex 13. If you have an accident in the United States, the NTSB rules apply. If you have an accident in Brazil, the Brazilian accident investigation rules apply, and so forth and so on. Understand what rules you are subjecting yourself to and what role your company plays in the investigation. Understand what role the criminal authorities will play in the investigation or in the interview process and the investigation process generally. There's no excuse to not understand those that sort of thing, and that's true whether there are other security considerations associated with operating into the country or not. That other information is available.
David, there's a couple of people asking sorry, go ahead.
I would just add that I think the risk of criminalization is greater today because of politics. That's been in a long time.
I agree.
and that there's no control you can exert over that because the news is ever changing and the political dynamics are there. So I think the risk of an accident being criminalized, whether in the United States or elsewhere, is stronger today than it was 19 years ago. And that there's really, the only way to be perfectly safe is to never leave the house. It's never to fly a flight. So it's just got to be baked into your emergency preparation, as Mark said.
A lot of it is, and things have changed in 19 years in terms of the internet and the 24/7 news cycle. And a lot of the criminalization is driven, quite frankly, by the availability of the 24/7 news cycle. Uh, Talking heads, families of victims, so forth, getting on that 24/7 news cycle and calling for action. In the United States, both at the federal level and at the state level, there are crime victim acts, and that victim legislation has played a significant role in the prosecutions involving the Boeing company that are presently going on, where the families of the Lion Air and the Ethiopian airline victims, passengers, have been pounding the table regarding criminal prosecution against the Boeing company. And that legislation gives the victims of crimes, both at the state and federal level in the United States, a voice in whether or not a criminal prosecution should take place. And I think David's right. I think that there is a greater receptivity to criminal prosecution today than there has been in the past.
Well, and not just with the air carriers, but as we saw in South Korea, it was the airport as well. So the scope is starting to broaden.
The one thing I would
That's
add is,
absolutely right.
and the one thing I would add is that there are criminal acts.
That's one of
Willfulness,
the questions. Yeah. One of the questions is how do we balance the need for justice with potential for over-criminalization? So David, go ahead. Sorry to interrupt you, but that's probably something that we could talk about now.
I want to be cautious not to give the impression that there's no criminality, there's no possibility of criminality in what we do. And so it is a delicate balance, but I think in something that is truly an accident, that's not part of willful conduct or pattern of behavior. I think the divide becomes clearer, but people seem to feel that justice is only served with blame. And that's not the underpinning of investigating accidents.
Right.
The goal is to prevent future accidents. But there's this feeling that somebody's got to pay, not just financially, but in terms of justice. And it's a risk. It will continue to be a risk. But I wouldn't, if somebody does something that's clearly criminal, then they should face criminalization. But an ordinary accident, in quotes, shouldn't be criminal. It should be a lesson for how to prevent it from happening to anybody else.
And I think it's fair to say that most criminalization within the United States historically has had to do with signing maintenance records, repair records, and so forth, attesting to the fact that things were done when they weren't done. Historically in the United States, the making of a mistake that has resulted in an accident has not been criminalized. I think perhaps there's a greater receptivity to that occurring now. Outside the United States, the mistake issue has more frequently than in the United States been escalated into criminal wrongdoing. Because as I said, understanding what a crime is important in advance, because we do have things like negligent homicide, so careless and reckless, things that ordinarily might support claims for punitive damages, which are civil damages, or just a mistake can get characterized in a criminal system as criminal conduct. And I think there's just no excuse for a lack of preparation if wherever you're going to operate, whether it's into the United States or outside the United States, or in particular outside the United States, if you will.
Yeah. So David, I want to turn this back over to you for some closing comments from you and Mark. And I just want to thank you for both of you, your time and your expertise in sharing that with everybody today. So David, any words of wisdom you can impart on all of us?
I'm going to steal from Mark. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a privilege to be part of this webinar. It's all about preparation. I think that we have to avoid the temptation to believe that accidents only happen to the other people. We have to, strikingly, after our accident, one of our executives said, well, we don't need to do emergency response planning anymore. We don't need to do drills because we've been there. We know how to deal with it. It doesn't always happen to the other person. Bad things happen to good people. If we were to do it over again, I would say that the most important thing we would have brought to the table was to be more prepared for the possibility. It's like any kind of insurance. You hope you never have to make a claim, but it's important to know that you have it. I can't overemphasize that accidents do happen no matter how much you prepare, but you do have to be prepared. It's important to prepare for the worst case scenario to protect your people, to protect the flying public, to protect people on the ground, and to protect your business for the people who depend on you for a paycheck. So you can't prepare too much, and it's the only way that you'll be in a position to defend against something really bad happening.
Thank you, David. Mark?
No, I'll echo everything David said. And just from a personal perspective, I've been doing this more decades than I care to count, and I have never run out of business. And I think that's sort of the best indicator. I think for many years, the last catastrophic airline disaster that we had in the United States prior to about a month ago was in 2009. And then, as everybody knows, in the context of about 30 days, we had a series of accidents in the United States, starting with the Potomac River midair, the Philadelphia medevac aircraft, a couple of helicopter accidents, the Learjet that hit the Gulf Stream. We've had a series of accidents that have reminded everybody that there but for the grace of God go I. And I hope that, if we've accomplished nothing else through these tragedies, that we've caused everybody within the industry to recognize that fact. And as David said, prepare for the fact that it's going to be you next time, hoping that it's never you.
Thank you, Mark. I will turn it back over to Elle-Marie for her closing comments.
All I want to say is thank you for your time. And David, thanks for sharing this tragic event and the stress and the difficulty that you've gone through all these years later, that we still benefit by that. And I think that's something that I've learned. We spoke about how 2025 has started in aviation. Barb and I has been involved in a few of, a couple of the ones that you've mentioned, Mark, and one in South Korea. And it was really incredible for me over and over again in my career, how every accident I go, gosh, we knew this, we knew it was coming, we could have done this, we didn't do that. There's always that aspect of going through these things, and it always boils down to preparation. So thank you so much, both of you, for your time. Thanks, Bob, for hosting so beautifully, as you always do. Henny, thank you for your technical expertise. We have shamelessly plugged Mark's details and Aviation Symposium. So it's somewhere in the chat, scroll up and find it. But you can also find him on LinkedIn. But any one of you who want to get in touch with us, to get David to come and speak, or to get in touch with Mark, let us know and we will happily connect you. Thanks everybody for your time. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, all.